Alright, me darlings. Well, it's time for our big review of the year, and yes, that means we've got some more furry action for you, though things are going to be a little bit more wholesome than the last two times.
Aww.
Oh, but don't worry, we've still got some fuzzy spice to look at here as well.
Woohoo!
But first, a little history on the webcomic. When the internet became a burgeoning resource to send information to everyone in the world, naturally people saw it as an opportunity to share their work and creative ability. But when it first came out, naturally you couldn't send much in terms of data. Videos and games were pretty much impossible to send, and even photos were tough to do without making it look like something you made on an old Atari console. But drawings made on a computer, now that could be done. And so, one of the first forms of creative work that could be shown to a wide audience online was the webcomic. The first webcomic was Eric Milliken's Witches and Stitches, which even predates the concept of the World Wide Web, starting in 1985 and being sent via local forms of digital communication. Which, just to give you a yardstick on this, that's the equivalent of an Instagram model sending pictures of themselves around by handing them out themselves while riding around on a bike.
Talk about Meals on Wheels.
Only you could make that sound dirty.
I thank you.
But as the internet grew, so did the amount of webcomics such as Netboy, Penny Arcade, and PvP. Naturally, since the internet was mostly used by geeks in the 90s, lots of these comics had to do with, or were influenced by geek culture. And let's remember here, what was a big burgeoning cult community fan base that really came into its own in the 90s?
Butthole surfer fans?
No, not that one.
Furries?
Bingo. Yes, as explained in a previous video, furry culture was truly born in the 90s, and while it had been a thing for a while before then, the 90s is where it really became its own thing, and with it also being very popular amongst nerds, naturally, it crossed paths with webcomics. So, of course, a lot of early webcomics were also furry themed, such as the previously reviewed Eric Schwartz's Sabrina Online, and others as well, such as Jay Naylor's Better Days and Martin Kellerman's Rocky.
Wait, say what?
All of which continue to this very day in some shape or form. The formula of these strips tends to be either in the style of a gag-a-day comic strip like Garfield and other comics such as that, or more serialized and narrative-driven stories like regular comics, or in some cases a mix between the two. Often these comics give the creators a chance to express their deep inner feelings, and in some cases make them semi-autobiographical, and in doing so really can make a strong connection to the reader and make it more endearing, which is where today's comic comes in. Enter John Ponikvar, a longtime furry enthusiast and cartoonist who got his start back in college in the late 90s, making furry drawings and comics of his own, and even making his own online communities based around them. And while he did this in an age where furries were not really regarded as the most respected subculture, not that things are that much better now anyway, but regardless, he still kept up his work because he loved it so much, and I really have to give him props for that. Doing what you love even if people don't love it back.
Well, that pretty much sums up your YouTube career.
Very funny. But he truly came into his own with the slice of life contemporary fantasy comic Peter and Company, a comic about an introverted adolescent boy who's being guided through the traps and pitfalls of puberty by his guardian spirit. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Let's start from the beginning. The first strips were published in 2005, which starts off with us going straight into the story without much lead-in, but there are some prelude comics that were made that previously were only available through the trade collections, but recently have been put on the website, so we might as well start with those. We're introduced to Peter, the main character, a lonely and none too popular young boy who's struggling to make his way through life. He's not that much good in school, his sister's not exactly a fan of him, and he's not got any friends.
All sounding a bit familiar to you?
Oh come on, there's plenty here that's not like my life.
Like what?
Well, I don't have a sister.
And what else?
Give me a minute. Well, anyway, after heading out after being tormented by his sister again and being ignored by his mum, he comes across a duck called Seth. At first it just seems like some weird guy who came out of nowhere, but as Peter soon discovers, there's more to him than that. Turns out he's what's known as a guardian, which are essentially imaginary friends, except they're real, but can only be seen by their kids that they are assigned to, and are there to help guide them through life and make them more rounded people.
Wait, I was chosen for a special friend because I'm a loser in the real world?
More or less.
That works fine for me, actually.
I hoped it would.
Maybe I'm your guardian and you just don't know it.
I doubt that very much. All you do is make my life worse.
Hey, life's about survival and fighting for things. I've just made you stronger to be better at that.
But I have to ask, at what point through all the bouts of mindless violence and insults has my life gotten any better?
Well, how many friends do you have now? How many people have you worked with to make stuff for this channel?
And how many of them have tried to kill me because you keep tormenting them?
Hey, no one said I couldn't have some fun in this job.
Well, anyway, after we meet Peter and Seth, the early comics are more of a gag-a-day style strips with Peter and Seth going through different little childhood adventures as Peter tries to grow into an adult. There are some events that become more established as elements in the story, like new characters such as Iggy the Lizard and his guardian Skin, who become friends with Peter and Seth, but the early strips were more about having innocent fun than being more of a narrative-driven story. But much like the kids themselves, there's always room for growth. It should be noted that the guardians of other people can be seen by those who have their own guardians, so Peter can see Skin and Iggy can see Seth and so on. I'm just hoping this doesn't turn into a drop-dead Fred situation where Peter ends up looking like a psycho because he keeps trying to stop Seth from playing the tuba. In all seriousness, while I'm usually not a fan of this invisible person style story, this one actually does it really well. There's less contrived and awkward slapstick humour derived from the guardians not being seen by others, and some of the ways in which the other characters react to the Guardians' kids acting weird is quite clever, so props to that on taking an idea that I usually hate and giving it a new twist. Hell, there was even a movie that came out this year that is basically the same plot as this comic, so evidently it was a bit ahead of its time. I especially like the bit where Peter asks Seth where his powers come from.
Hey Seth, how did you get all your powers and stuff?
Well, I sure wasn't born with them. It was actually a long time ago. I was working in a lab developing a new form of energy. And suddenly, there was an explosion, and my frail body was bombarded with radiated particles, leaving me invisible. Well, to most people, anyway.
I don't think I believe you.
Good for you.
Hey, sometimes the truth just isn't as interesting as a lie. That being said, the early strips are not without their flaws. The early comics are sometimes a little hard to follow. They do follow the traditional comic strip format, but aren't always as serialized, so sometimes it can feel like you accidentally turned over 2 pages at once. It's not too tricky to understand what's going on, but since a lot of these early comics establish a lot of plot points that carry over for the rest of the story, it can make it a bit tricky to understand what's going on. For example, in strip 49, we're introduced to Jeff and Eddie. Now, at first I thought Eddie was supposed to be an elite guardian, another kind of guardian established in these stories that disguise themselves as regular pets and sort of indirectly try to change their kids. They established this earlier with another elite guardian called Persephone, who is the pet guardian of the popular girl in Peter's school, Chelsea, but apparently that's not the case since Eddie talks to Jeff, which elites aren't supposed to do, yet Jeff doesn't seem to acknowledge that Eddie is anything but a dog, even though he talks. It all seems a little bit confusing to me. Also, Eddie does come back several times where he seems to be the boss of Seth and the other Guardians, so that just makes things even more confusing for me. Granted, this is early on in the strip's timeline, and there are always early entry things that seem a bit inconsistent and odd, but it's just the creator working things out, and this is by no means a story ruiner, it just makes it a tad confusing for me at first, but I will say the artwork for the strip more than makes up for it. The artwork in the early strips, while it is still good, you can tell that it's John finding his feet in terms of his skill, so sometimes there are a few inconsistencies or just some odd-looking drawings, but it doesn't detract from the overall experience, and in some cases, he actually utilizes it really well, since he really does have a knack for drawing expressive and goofy faces. It's great. It's what you call the in-between frame art style.
Which is what I also call the style of your face.
In terms of the art style, however, that is completely unique in and of itself. When I did the Sabrina Online review, I compared it to the Animaniacs style, but here I really can't think of a style to compare it directly to. I can see some influence from other things like Warner Brothers cartoons, Calvin and Hobbes and Garfield, but it's not like you'd look at this and say it would fit alongside those. But I still really like it, and it has the feel where all the characters seem like they're made of soft clay. And it really works with not just having a lot of great expressions and comedic moments, but making it feel very soft and comforting, which works in conjunction perfectly with the tone the strip is going for. Of course, artists always evolve, and John is no exception, as similar to Eric Schwartz's art style, his has become less exaggerated and more grounded over time, which, like Sabrina Online, I do prefer the older style, but the newer style still keeps the bits that made the older style work, the softness mixed with great detail, the expressions and the creativity, just to a lesser extent, but it still looks great. And one thing he does well is make all the characters look distinct and memorable, which is really tricky to do, especially when starting with black and white. Jay Naylor can vouch for that, but here you can tell which characters are supposed to be which just by looking at them. Also, the evolution of the line work for the series is just gorgeous. It's so well detailed and bold, it's amazing. It's worth noting though that John doesn't always work on these strips on his own. As he was making the strips, he eventually got into contact with a girl called Whitney who he met via Yahoo Messenger when she was just starting at the college he had just graduated from. And they got on really well. Really, really well. And I suppose it's quite poetic that a comic that is about venturing into the real world and interacting with other people, guided by something that technically isn't real, helped John also venture out and find someone whom he loves and spent the rest of his life with.
Oh my god, that is so beautiful.
You know what they say, life imitates art. But anyway, when John and Whitney officially became a couple in real life, they started working on these strips together, which is so cute. John still did the drawings and Whitney would do the colouring and shading, just like Terry and Rachel Dodson, which is adorable. I also like how the sequel series confirming that they do get together and the fourth wall jokes Peter and co make about it happening takes away that whole will they won't they thing, which usually I like, especially when the guy's an awkward nerd.
I wonder why.
Shut it. But while taking away that uncertainty does make it less tedious and frustrating, which will they won't they stories can often turn into, it does rob us of that romantic anticipation, but I don't mind that too much. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get back to the comic's plot. As the strip goes on, we're introduced to more characters. Peter's sister Ezzy, who is not necessarily the sister from hell, but she's clearly not a fan of her brother, though by no means hates him. Peter's mother, who, while is not the best mother in the world, clearly loves her son and does everything she can to take care of him. The previously established popular girl Chelsea, who, while not exactly the nicest person on the outside, is certainly someone who has a softer side, which Persephone tries to bring out of her to varying degrees of success.
Hey, Chelsea, I want to talk to you about what happened yesterday.
Peter, get this through your head. I'm popular, you are not. And nothing you say will ever change that.
Wow, Chelsea, that thing on your neck is getting bigger.
Well played, Peter.
Thanks.
Also, I may just be seeing things, but it seems to me that perhaps Chelsea has a bit of a Helga from Hey Arnold thing going on with Peter, since she seems to like him but never lets it show. Perhaps it's just me projecting the fantasy of wanting the popular girls to like shy nerds, but that's just how I saw it.
Oh, you really need a girlfriend.
Well, if you're my guardian, why don't you get to sorting that out?
Look, I can't do miracles.
And, of course, more characters get introduced as the series goes on, but we'll get to that. I also want to say that I love the more rural town setting. So many webcomics take place in a suburban or city environment, but this really helps capture that childhood innocence of living around nature and exploring the natural world while you explore yourself as a child. I love that kind of thing in a coming-of-age story. Hell, they even point it out in one strip.
Do you ever wonder why you're always in the woods, Peter?
Because I like them?
It's symbolic. The woods are uncharted, so they enhance the feeling of being lost. It's a reflection of the story.
What are you talking about?
Don't you get it, Peter? It's... On that note, this comic has definitely got some very surreal and weird things about it sometimes, and it does make it a tad hard to follow, as I said before, but it is very creative, and as a result, you certainly do remember it. I think what helps is that we still have normal characters grounding the craziness and their hilarious reactions that are in large part thanks to the great facial expressions. It helps make the situations feel a little bit more real rather than just nonsense for the sake of nonsense. It weirdly reminds me of the Mighty Boosh in that way. Korgar, the math teacher, is a prime example of that, since in this world there's just an orc for some reason and they teach maths apparently, and it makes no sense, but you kind of just accept it. Though this does make me wonder what kind of math teachers John must have had, since I went to a state school in Sussex and I can tell you one thing, the math teachers there are by far and away the least scariest things in schools like that. Those are places that are so rough even the school nurse once told me to stop being a bitch.
To be fair, I can imagine you were at her office every other day.
I was, but that's only because I played this one certain game so much in the playground.
What game was it?
Kick the George.
I should join that sport. I'd be a world champion.
There's another element that I like, which is with the worms, who are sort of childless guardians that only exist to cause mischief and mess with people. They're sort of like gremlins in that regard. And while, again, it doesn't make much sense, it's just a cool little extra bit in the comic that makes it more entertaining and establishes the kind of world that this is. They even become a major plot point early on, where their continued activity around Peter causes his sister to believe that their house is haunted, and she calls in some paranormal investigators, one of whom is a fish in a scuba suit. Again, it's so bizarre, how can you not love that? They also mess around with the fourth wall a bit in the comic, which I always like. I love the bit where Peter's mum's word balloon falls on top of him. That is a full-on Deadpool moment right there. How long before Peter tries to beat up Seth with the edge of the comic panel? Hell, there's even a bit where Peter talks to John directly.
Rather than spend time alone, do more with Iggy. Include him in your little adventures, or reach out to new people. It's about time you started to become more socially active.
Well, I would, if the strip would update regularly for a change. Hey! What? It's true. I'm graduating from college. Cut me some slack.
Plus, the whole coming-of-age element is really sweet and endearing, and I really like that, and it reminds me a lot of Calvin and Hobbes, but with more of an ongoing story to it, which is a really cool idea. And just before we get back to the plot recap, just a personal note, Izzy is hilarious. I don't know what they're trying to imply with why his character is like the way he is, but he's just so funny.
Fantastic. It's Seth's day off and I'm stuck in a locker. Wait, what am I worried about? This is a school. There's bound to be someone who will help me.
Aw, I'll try to help you, Mr. Talking Locker.
On second thought, I'm gonna die.
My apple was talking to me this morning, too. But then I ate him.
He's like Ralph Wiggum if he made even less sense. Although we do seemingly get a reason as to why in one strip.
Iggy, why are you so afraid of frisbees?
Well, when I was little, I was playing in front of my house when all I could do was watch as the disc flew ever closer on a collision course with my face. And then all of a sudden, the aliens came down, took me into their ship, and stole part of my brain.
Never tell me anything again, Iggy.
Hey, potatoes! Is that what happened to you?
How dare you! Though the aliens did take something much more precious to me.
What's that?
My hair. Anyway, back to the plot. Much like the Sabrina Online review, I can't go over every single storyline because that would take me forever, so I'm just going to cherry pick the ones that I think are the most important to the narrative and ones that I think are the best. After the Ghost Hunter story, it's revealed that due to Peter's bad grades, he has to attend summer school to catch up, where we're introduced to Korgar.
Ignorant youthful souls, I am Korgar. Prepare to absorb the laws of math. We will begin with the first lesson. Submission.
I think he means subtraction.
Submission!
It's funny to think his entire character was born from the misspelling of an American supermarket chain. Maybe we could invent a character called Texos.
Sounds like the name of a robot.
Exactly. And he'd be a lot easier to voice too. I could just use some audio filters for that one. Of course, this doesn't help with Peter's self-confidence, and this is exacerbated when Chelsea has a sleepover with Ezzy, and he's worried that they're going to talk about him and make him even more of a social pariah. Peter wants Seth to use his powers to rain on their parade, but of course Seth says he's not allowed to use his powers in that way. The worms, however, have no such qualms. As you can imagine, this doesn't go over too well. This then leads to Persephone feeling like she's not doing enough to influence Chelsea's better qualities, though to be fair, I think even the most patient and humble person in the world would react the way she did, and I would too. But this leads to a point where the comic gets to show off its more serious side, and it works really well, with Persephone getting more into the regrets about her job, showing that the Guardians are just as vulnerable to the mistakes and emotions of humanity as we are, though granted she's not exactly been the most faithful pet.
You guys just need to find a lucky rabbit like mine. Hey, traitor!
If you got it, flaunt it.
It also has some genuine emotional moments. There's a real tearjerker where it's revealed one of Seth's former kids' lives hasn't gone so well, and it's genuinely a really sad moment and a great little window into how stories like this aren't always rainbows and sunshine.
His name was Stephen. He was the youngest child I had ever been assigned to protect. He was only 4 years old when I first appeared to him. He had a very broken family. His father had vanished, and his mother wasn't fit to raise him by herself. She was neglectful, and would leave him alone for days at a time, as if she didn't care about his safety or welfare. She never even attempted to put him through school, so I had to teach him how to read at the library. I did everything I could do to make sure that at the very least, he would be able to handle life on his own. But after all I managed to do to protect him, I just couldn't save him from himself.
Even magic can't save you from depression. It's worth noting that, much like the Fairly Odd Parents, when a guardian leaves, the person that they were assigned to has no memory of them. So this makes it hit home even harder that this guy wouldn't even know how upset Seth is over his final decision. It's really heavy. Granted, us getting out of this situation by making a joke about Skin's lisp is a little silly, but I can still give John mad props for going this heavy and not making it seem too jarring or overbearing. Well done there. But the storyline after this one is where things start to get really interesting. At the 101st strip, Whitney enters the picture, though her design is a bit different here, with a much darker colour and different style of her hair than she would eventually have. Her inclusion into this point in the comic is purely circumstantial, since this would have been around the time John and Whitney met in real life. But I think it was a good thing that she didn't appear until this point, since it gave Peter a chance to develop as his own character. So many romance stories seem to struggle in showing couples as individuals instead of effectively being a single character on their own. It's great when you can have a couple that have great chemistry like that, but they still are individual people, so it's good Peter was able to shine on his own before Whitney entered the picture. It was also a great way to switch things up and add a new level of interest to the story and a cool new character. Also, this running gag in the series where Peter gets really flustered by Whitney makes his fur stand up on end. It's really cute.
A shame that can't happen for you.
You're mistaken, Huck. My head does stand up on end when I get flustered too. Just not on my head.
Ew.
I also love in which their relationship begins. It's very organic. Peter finds he has to go to summer school, and just who happens to be sitting next to him?
Wow.
As the story goes on, more and more plot threads about Peter trying to either become closer to or impress Whitney happen. And it reminds me a lot of the dynamic between Roxanne and Max in a Goofy movie, and it's super sweet. They first start getting closer when Whitney also has to go to summer school and gives Korgar the sharp end of her tongue.
Korgar demands your answer.
And Whitney demands you back off.
Korgar will give you space.
Thank you.
I think I'm starting to like her now, too.
And then later Persephone and Seth tried to help out Peter with talking to her by having Percy morph into her, which goes about as well as you'd expect.
It seems to me you just need to work on getting over your shyness.
Easier said than done. Just the sight of her is enough to make me stupid.
When talking to her, you just need to breathe in deep and keep calm. I know she's pretty, but don't let it break your stride. Now then, stand up, face Whitney, and introduce yourself.
Hi,
Peter?
George!
Yeah? But it's not all about them. As the strip goes on, we're introduced to another new character, Tracy, nicknamed Tito, a classroom rival of Peter who is fiercely driven to succeed, which naturally clashes with Peter's goofball personality.
Listen, you little creep, I'm not about to have my 4.2 GPA tarnished because some ignorant boob couldn't pull his own weight. So you will do your research, you will do your part, or I will rain down upon you.
But there is a lot of focus on the possibility of Whitney and Peter getting together, which has a bump in the road that is caused by this guy. This rival suitor to Whitney called Jake shows up, and at first I figured he was going to be a generic piece of arm candy for her, until I realised that the way he's drawn and the way he acts is kind of a parody of John himself, which is really funny. It is kind of weird since Peter also is meant to be kind of an avatar for John in the story as well, but to be fair, only somewhat loosely. But still, it is a lot to get your head around when the rival for Whitney's affections to the main character is a parody of the guy in real life Whitney is married to, or at least that's how I saw it.
Freud would have a fun time with that one.
I will admit that I do like how they make him very nice and friendly. He's not just some jerk, and Whitney eventually does break it off with him because he's actually too nice and a bit too clingy. I like that. Proof that some guys can be too nice.
But that's not a problem for you, is it?
Shut up. But that pretty much brings us up to now. The most recent plotline is how Persephone is now going around as a girl in Peter's school, trying to be an indirect guardian to Chelsea, as a panda girl called Chloe, which is a really clever idea, not just because it probably is a better way to help her, but we get some funny fish out of water gags with her trying to be a normal girl, which are actually quite funny. Normally they're jokes I don't like, but again, John makes it work. And it also leads to a really good plotline involving Chelsea coming to terms with not having her rabbit Pearl, Persephone's previous guardian form. in her life anymore, and again, it gets pretty heavy and emotional, but in a really good way. I especially love the bit where Chelsea explains how much Pearl means to her to Chloe, who of course is Pearl, which is a really clever idea and a really sweet moment. That is pretty much up to the point we are in Peter and Company, since it's still ongoing, but we do have a sequel in the form of Peter and Whitney. Peter and Whitney, the follow-up series, takes a more grounded approach and is more about the development of a relationship than a coming-of-age story, but it works and feels like a natural progression. Admittedly, it is a little weird to have a sequel series while the first series is still going, but hey, it worked for the Mega Man games, and I guess John just couldn't wait to draw Whitney's grown-up boobs.
And who could blame him? You could get lost for days in those things.
No kidding. And to be fair, they leave the events of what happened in the previous series rather vague. The only thing we know for certain is that Peter and Whitney did seem to hit it off, but then had to move away from each other to go to college. A typical high school romance situation. But as it turns out, the college Peter goes to has some familiar faces, like Tito.
Tracy?
Oh, Peter, what a pleasant surprise.
Tell me about it.
And, of course, Whitney.
Whitney?
Oh my god, it is you! What are you doing here? I didn't know you came to SCAD. It's so good to see you. Oh my gosh, how have you been?
Good. I'm good. Very good.
Regardless, it is really cute, and nice for this comic to have the freedom to get into more adult jokes and situations, including an amazing first kiss moment.
How is it even more windy than before?
I don't know, this is crazy.
Whoa! I got you. Are you okay?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. We should probably, try to walk to... Or we could give it a few minutes.
I like that idea.
Say, those guys look familiar. This comic's still just starting out, so we'll probably get a ton more stuff to dive into as time goes on, but there's plenty more to look at when it comes to this franchise, and many of which involve Whitney's assets.
Aw, yeah.
As you can imagine, in this sequel series, the grown-up version of Whitney became the big, sexy character of this franchise, and god damn does she look good. John really has one hell of a muse with her. It's also refreshing to see a more plus-size sexy furry character, which I feel is such a rarity. Not just in the furry world, but the porn world in general, at least up until recently, really didn't go for more full-figured women, but that has started to change, which is great to see. Now, if only the men's side of that industry could get the same treatment. This has also started two image series of sorts, one in which where Whitney cosplays in different characters' outfits from geek culture, which is great fan service, in more ways than one, and another more recent one where she dresses up in different kinds of lingerie, and both are fantastic and a lot of fun. And I do have to say, this is probably some of the best romantic writing I've ever seen in my life. It probably helps that it also comes from a real life husband and wife couple, but I don't know what it is, but just something about this is so endearing and wistful, and I can't help but adore that. But stepping back for a little bit, writing comic strips is surprisingly quite tricky. It's all about using the amount of panels you have as a form of comedic timing, and to have a quick setup and punchline in a small package. Veteran writers like Jim Davis and Bill Watterson were so good they practically had it down to a science, to the point where if you mix and match panels from their comics, they're still funny, and while it took a bit of time, these Peter and Company comics eventually got into that rhythm as well. I also love the way the text and the word balloons are handwritten. I really hate it when webcomics get lazy and just type out the dialogue in them. Having the dialogue be lovingly hand done is a really good way to add an extra level of charm and human connection to it, and this does have some of the most endearing handwriting I've ever seen in one. The best comic strips have handwriting that is so distinctive in its style that you can tell what the comic is just by looking at the text, and this is definitely one of them. The only complaints I have about this franchise are really minor things, like the things I mentioned before, and how the contrast from the very innocent and mostly light-hearted tone of Peter and Company and the more mature and raunchy themes of the Peter and Whitney comic and the subsequent artwork that surrounds it is a little bit jarring, but I suppose it does show the leap from innocence of youth to the exploration of adulthood. And, well, given John's drawings of Whitney are so good, I'm not complaining. But besides that, I really love these two comics, and I'm in a debate as to whether or not it's become my new favourite webcomic, but it is really damn good. Also, I've just realised the name of the forest in Peter & Co. is basically my last name with the first syllable changed.
Where the hell is New Huck City?
I don't know, but I am not going there.
Oh, come on. The city is so cool they named it after me.
That's what worries me. But regardless, the Peterverse, as it's known, is a really good webcomic series and I really recommend you check it out. There is a plan to bring the first comic to life in the form of an animated series, and while it's a long road to get to it, the early tests do show promise.
I don't care if she invited half the school.
Most of which appear to be boys.
What's important is that she invited me, which she would not have done if she didn't think I was special.
Are you?
Whitney!
Ah!
Nice to meet you. I've seen you around school before, but I feel like I recognize you from somewhere else.
I'll just walk over to Chelsea's with a huge target on my face so she can make my life a living hell. I don't remember that at all.
Now how long before we get an animated series, right Huck? Huck? Hey, have you seen Huck anywhere?
No.
Nope.
Sorry,
Well.
I haven't seen them.
Nah, I can't say I have. Sorry, dude.
Why does he always run off near the end of the reviews? What, does he think I've got nothing better to do except for wait around for him?
I thought he'd never leave.